in the bee-lound glade. Can we change the slide? Yeah. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. Their midnights all a glimmer, and the noon a purple glow, and the evening full of linnets' wings. Right? Yeah, that's the Lake Isle of Innisfree. And what is interesting about this poem is that there is this question of colonialism which is being talked about. Remember that when we talk about the viceroys and the governor generals, we had a lot of them in India. And what is interesting is this post of the viceroy was actually created for Ireland so that Ireland could be kept in control of the English. Now, Yeats's longing for this Lake Isle is a longing to get away and to be free. And this is in many ways considered as this kind of going back to one's own native land.
Yeah.
Okay, we might notice that he talks about India. And what is interesting is that India is a colony, but Ireland is a colony that's there much longer.
And also, I think you should look at the fact that his writing, even if he's talking about a longing for freedom or a longing for a country of his own, he is still talking in very romantic terms. He's not talking in the powerful, bare language that he uses later on in life. If you look at his poetic development, the example that we have given you is Lake Isle of Innisfree, he starts with a romantic, idealized poetic style of Shelley, but what marks him specially is his focus on language, skill, rhyme, rhythm and intonation. Later, he adopts a very simple and bare style and goes back with this simplicity to nationalist themes after the Easter 1916 rising. At the same time, he develops a private mythology with gyres and so on, and this too becomes the subject of his poetry.
Yeah, could I just say something before we go on?
Would you like me to go to the previous slide?
Yeah, maybe you could do that. What is interesting about Yeats as a romantic, and especially when we talk about Lake Isle of Innisfree, is this kind of a desire to escape, a desire to go back to a kind of free world and a free land. Okay, the Yeats that we also know later is a Yeats who's influenced by by Japanese theatre and what is called the symbolist movement. As we'll find, and as I mentioned some time ago, when he talks about the wild swans at Cool, or he's talking about the women of the sheath, now these are largely something that's far more than what the poem is giving you, and this is what we normally associate poems with, as we'll see when we come to the second coming.
Yeah. In this poem, such a short poem, but it tells us about Yeats's poetic practice. If you look at the poem, it says, I made my song a coat covered with embroideries out of old mythologies from heel to throat. So he talks about a coat, but the coat is a symbol for the poetry that he wrote. A poetry which draws on old myths and legends and full of complicated images and very romantic style of writing. But the fools caught it, wore it in the world's eyes as though they'd wrought it. And this was immediately accepted by the world. It became very popular and people started imitating it almost. Song, let them take it, he says. There is more enterprise in walking naked. And what he means by that is, not going back?
Maybe, it's okay.
Yeah. What he means by that is that Now on, he is no longer going to write poetry full of embroidery, but he is going to be bare and simple, and he is going to write in an entirely new way. If you look at this, here are some of his important poems. Lake Isle of Innisfree, would you like to talk about, quickly go through these?
Yeah, we did talk about Lake Isle of Innisfree and this kind of romanticism that's associated with it. We also have the Easter 1916, which is both romantic and a very nationalist poem, and at the same time it's interwoven with Irish metaphors and Irish history. Right now, Among School Children is another poem that I think we all know about. And over there, one of the last lines is something that we all remember. Can you separate the dancer from the dance? Then we have another poem called Prayer for My Daughter. And of course, the Byzantium poems, Sailing to Byzantium is one of them, which is talking again about a salmon swimming backstream up the river. And at the same time, there is this myth of Cuchulainn in the background, talking about self-regeneration and vitality and youth, which is something that Yeats tried in his personal life again and again. And we could probably talk a lot about how he even gets married to a girl who is so much younger than him, or a woman who's only 26 when he's 52. Then, of course, there is the tar, which is something that recurs again and again in his poetry, and that becomes an important symbol. In fact, he buys a tar in which he and Georgie Hiley's live in, and I think that's in 1917 that he buys this kind of tar.
Then we have, let's quickly go through the rest of the poems. That is the circus animal's desertion, the Cuchulainn poems, the Crazy Jane poems. Some interesting poems are Why Should Not Old Men Be Mad, Take Off That Burning Mask of Gold. And the last two poems, Leda and the Swan and The Second Coming, these are poems that we will be discussing in detail, and these are often poems that are discussed in class as well.
Yeah, I would like to just say that for Yeats, the mask is something that one should put on. Though he says take off that burning mask of gold in this poem, one should become familiar with one's mask. And he's got a long theory about how masks are used, which comes back into his symbology again and again. Yeah.
We'll start now with Leda and the Swan, and Rajan will discuss this poem for you, open out its symbolism, and tell you why this poem is really important. Take a look at the first section of the poem.
A sudden blow, the great wings beating still, above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs, and how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? Let us think about what Yeats is trying to do here. You can see at the side that there is a picture from a Greek vase, which is extremely important for the mythology behind the story. Leda is this ravishing beauty, which who is actually somebody who attracts the eye of Zeus, who's the father of the gods. And here you have him falling in love with Leda, but he ravishes her, and out of that ravishment you have a huge or a new moment coming up, which is the moment of Greek history. At one level, Yeats wants to go back to that kind of moment because he believes in a tremendous, as we have in Easter 1916, a tremendous beauty is born. And yes, that's a beautiful moment, but it's also a moment, as we see in the next few lines, where it's sad, it's terrible, and it also talks about the present, which is so frightening.
Yeah. When Zeus ravishes Leda, what happens is she gets pregnant and gives birth to Helen. Helen, as you will know, is the beauty who is the cause of the Trojan War. The Trojan War results in the destruction of Troy, but side by side, even though Greece has won the war, Greece slowly falls into a decline, and it gradually, Greek culture, Greek civilization disintegrates. So the first section of the poem focuses on the power and violence with which Zeus takes hold of Leda and overpowers her.
I also think that it's important at this point of time that here you have the First World War and the Second World War and all these tremendous catastrophes taking place which are human made in the 20th century, and there is an anxiety that again Europe and European culture will be totally destroyed. So it's important to preserve it in poetry.
Yeah. Now take a look at the next section of the poem.
A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop.
What is said in this section is a really interesting thing. She says, Yeats says that if in that moment when Zeus takes Leda, he asks the question, was it possible that Leda knew what this moment was going to bring? Was it going to bring the broken wall of Troy, how Troy was looted, burnt and destroyed? Did she foresee that Agamemnon would be murdered and killed? And at that moment where Zeus, as the swan, is ravishing her, did she come to know that the death of civilization is taking place at the very moment that a new life is being created?
I think we also have to think that though this seems a very modern kind of poem, what is important is there is Helen at the background, okay, and for Yeats, as a romantic somewhere in his past, the personal has to become very important. And when one reads it carefully, behind the poem is the idea of Maud Gonne, right? And on the other side is the birth of the Irish nation, as you have the birth of a new civilization which is taking place with Zeus and Leda.
Yeah. The poem is also a poem which talks about the relationship between power and knowledge. What is this relationship between knowing what is going to happen and the power that such knowledge brings? It's a poem which also talks about the violence which can take place between men and women. It's a poem which also tells us about sensuality and the impact that such sensuality may have long after that moment has passed. It offers us a view of history which suggests to us that events which take place in the present have perhaps got their seed long time in the past.
But at the same time, what is important is that Helen was the one who is supposed to have launched 1,000 ships or been the reason for the war between Greece and Troy. But in the 20th century, that is not possible. Yeats always wants to go back to this kind of royalist position okay, a classist kind of position, which he practices in his own life because Lady Gregory is a person who funds his poetry and funds his writing, and that is a problem that we perhaps would have with Yeats's political position.
We'll now go to the next poem, and the next poem is called The Second Coming. It's a poem that was written at the time of great wars, not only World War I, but also the terrible violence that Ireland was seeing as a result of a civil war, its guerrilla war against the British, and the war generally that you found all across the world. The scene that Yeats paints in this poem is a world of chaos and disintegration. This is a poem where he draws upon the symbols that he has put together in his private mythology. He says, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The first image is an image where the relationship between the falcon and the falconer is breaking apart. The falcon goes higher, wider and wider, in wider and wider circles away from the falconer, so far that the relation between the falcon and the falconer breaks down completely. When it breaks down, all that is left is anarchy. Anarchy, and everywhere one can see only blood.
I think we can perhaps look at the actual meaning in Christian terminology of what you call the second coming.